Throne of Eldraine released in fall 2019 following War of the Spark. Like War of the Spark, it's a very polarizing set in the eyes of players. On one hand, it introduced us to a medieval fantasy plane with mechanics like adventures and food tokens, and provided a twist on a lot of classic fairy tales. On the other hand, it also introduced us to cards like Mystic Sanctuary, Once Upon a Time, Lucky Clover. Oh right, yeah, imagine telling somebody a few years before this that Lucky Clover would be good enough to be banned. And of course, Oko, Thief of Crowns. All of these cards went on to terrorize and were eventually banned in different Magic the Gathering formats. In the background of all of this, Throne of Eldraine also had a mechanic called Adamant, an effect that triggers when 3 mana of a single color is spent to cast a spell. It's a mechanic with only 17 non-commander cards and is only released in one standard legal set. Today, let's explore Adamant, its design history and its effects on limited and standard, what went wrong with its design, and what could be done to help breathe new life into this mechanic. During the creation of Throne of Eldraine, the design team decided they wanted to focus more on some monocolored design spaces, having just come off of 3 Ravnica sets, a famously multicolored plane. With Arthurian mythos doing a lot of heavy lifting with the lore of Eldraine, they eventually settled on the idea of the 5 courts, the different kingdoms of sorts that rule over different parts of the realm. The courts involved multiple cycles, from the Sur cycle, the Castle cycle, and the Monarch cycle. I know Gadwick isn't technically the king of Vantris, but a mirror that spends most of his time underwater tends to have issues ruling a court. This emphasis on monocolored costs went hand in hand with another idea that design was throwing around: alternate mana costs. The original design of Adamant involved cards with 2 different mana costs, one that was more generic and more expensive, and one that was cheaper but pip heavier. If you cast it for the pip heavier option, it would gain additional effects. While creative liked the idea, set design didn't let this get through to the final product, as they felt that 2 mana costs overcomplicated things. And honestly, good on them. The overcrowding on the graphic design level of having 2 mana costs on a card would have been atrocious. So it was instead turned into a mechanic, and Adamant was born. All but 2 cards on release were monocolored to reinforce the theming of the 5 courts. These new cards included a cycle of knights with Adamant from each of the courts with a color pie effect, really hammering home the idea that these creatures were adamant in their belief of their virtue. Pairing with the Adamant cards were a mix of color pie effects, ranging from life gain and vigilance, drawing and scrying, milling and creating a food token, famously black mechanic, damage to players and creatures, and fight pump and regrowth. The 2 colorless creatures either drew a card or entered with +1/+1 counters. Alright, so we've got a mechanic that incentivizes monocolored design in a set that's pulling away from multicolored design. So surely this mechanic can find a home in limited and standard, right? Right? The impact of Adamant in Constructed has been minuscule, if not non-existent. It doesn't help that the mechanic has no rare or mythic rare cards, instead relegated to just being commons or uncommons. And even in Pauper, those commons have not seen any play. Unfortunately, the part about Constructed is going to be real short because there's just nothing to write home about for these cards. They just had no impact. So right off the bat, we have a low printed mechanic that hasn't really seen any play in Constructed formats, and it's not hard to see why. The elephant in the room with Adamant is that its written mana cost is completely different than its perceived mana cost. Sure, Hengewalker can be played as a 3 mana 2/2, but if you want the Adamant effect, it's now either a triple white, triple blue, triple black, triple red, or triple green 3/3. Even for 2019, this is a horrific rate for the stat line. Now apply this to every single card with Adamant. This is its first issue. The written mana costs are misleading. Every monocolored Adamant card now has 2 additional color pips on it that you have to think about in order to get your full effect. But if you don't have the mana to play for Adamant, you can just play the base version of the card. And this is true, and some of them are decent without their Adamant effect. Slaying Fire isn't unreasonably overcosted for its rate, and Cauldron's Gift is on rate for a standard legal reanimation spell at the time. Rally for the Throne is a more expensive Raise the Alarm. These are the best base cards Adamant has to offer, and that's the second problem with it. Without the Adamant effect, the majority of the cards are just bad. Even the Night Cycle doesn't escape this fate. At best, they're on rate for their mana cost in Limited. At worst, they desperately need their Adamant trigger to get to a middling stat line. Do you really want to spend 4 mana on a slightly better regrowth? Is a 3 mana Sign in Blood the best thing to slot in? Oh, but if you make its mana cost triple black, you get a food token on top of it, and if you think about it, that's just divination with upside. Unexplained Visions draws 3 at sorcery speed for 5 mana. Yippee. And the worst part is this card could have been fine with its Adamant effect, but the scry happens after the draw. These last 2 examples embody the 3rd issue of Adamant. Even if you do pay for the Adamant cost alongside the regular, it's usually too underpowered to even bother. Now, before you go to the comments section and type a comment about how I'm being unfair because it's a limited design mechanic, so of course it's not going to be anything groundbreaking or even really all that powerful, let's see what Mark Rosewater himself has to say about Adamant's popularity. It was a workhorse mechanic that mattered a little in Limited and almost not at all in Constructed. I don't think it would upset most players if it returned, but very few are eager for it. Only a handful of players have ever asked for its return. For a mechanic that was designed for Limited, it only mattering a little in that environment at the cost of its popularity and constructed viability doesn't imply success. Adamant is a 7 on the Storm scale. Not because of power levels, not because of rules complexity, but because, at best, people aren't eager to see it back, and at worst, players don't even know it exists. And the worst fate that can befall a mechanic isn't that it's bad, it's that it becomes unmemorable and forgotten. Before we get into the next part, I want to go on a small tangent here, and if you've watched my Phyrexian video, you've already seen me go on a similar tangent. But again, I want to bring up the 1 set per plane philosophy. In the past in Magic the Gathering, planes would be stayed on for more than 1 set as a way to flesh out the story and flesh out the mechanics. This meant that even if a mechanic didn't have the best showing in the first set, it could always grow in sets 2 and 3 to really come into its own. But modern day design instead jumps from plane to plane. 1 set, 1 plane. This means that a lot of mechanics are just one-off and designed for a specific 1 plane, 1 set, so they don't get that chance to really grow and expand. Throne of Eldraine was the first set where they truly committed to this. Now, they had done 1 set per plane before, and you could argue that the Ravnica sets are basically 1 mechanic per 1 set because they don't really flesh them out as much, but Throne of Eldraine was the moment where they didn't go back. And one of the biggest victims of this set design philosophy, in my mind, has always been Adamant. Imagine how many mechanics never got a chance to truly shine because they were just a limited mechanic. Alright, so a quick disclaimer, this next part is pure speculation and idea spitballing on my part. Everyone's gonna have a billion different ideas on what could be done in design, and Adamant's gonna be no different. So maybe for you, I'm really on the mark here. Maybe for you, this is the worst idea you've ever heard. Either way, if you've got ideas of your own, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. I'd love to hear them. To kick off this section, let's lay out the restrictions of working with Adamant Adamant as a mechanic. It triggers when 3 of the same color of mana is used when casting a spell. Simple enough. There is a card in Throne of Eldraine that breaks this and is technically a big Adamant effect. Sundering Stroke has Adamant, but for the entire mana cost, not just 3. So, moving Adamant away from needing specifically 3 mana of the same color to a certain amount of the same color is another path forward. Personally, I'm not a big fan of directly altering a mechanic, so I won't go into it too much, but just keep it in mind as a potential option. We're also presented with an interesting challenge because Adamant is the setup, not the payoff. Because of this, Adamant cards can do basically anything, but the setup is the same every single time. But that's okay. So with the restrictions in place, let's get the obvious idea out of the way. We could just turn up the dial on the Adamant payoffs. Giving Adamant some rares or mythic rares with effects that match the rarity is a quick and easy way to help it out, but it's a little too easy. Again, it's the setup, not the payoff. I could give a card Adamant, win the game, and pat myself on the back and call it a job well done, but that's not really solving the issues. Instead, I'm gonna present one of my ideas as a potential path to go forward with Adamant. And just as a quick disclaimer, any cards that I pop up in this section are proof of concepts and are arbitrarily balanced, so if I make the most broken thing ever, sorry, I'm not an entire design team. Mark Rosewater himself has said that Adamant is a mechanic that incentivizes monocolored deck building, and he'd really only bring it back if a set or plane needed a monocolor workhorse. But what if instead we apply Adamant to multicolored cards? Instead of going the color card route and needing 3 mana of one specific color, let's go the colorless card route and need 3 mana of any one color. Story-wise, Adamant can make its triumphant return on either a new plane, a new Eldraine set, or Ravnica for the 80 billionth time, whatever works when we release it. Make it a story with a struggle between rising new powers and the old guard desperately trying to stay relevant, with people caught in the middle having to pick a side. The name of the mechanic now means something more than just, I'm adamant in my court's virtue. And I mean, yeah, I'd hope so. It's now, I'm adamant in my beliefs and ideals. Monocolored Adamant cards can be used to show people that are already sympathetic to one side, and that sympathy becomes solidified when cast for their Adamant cost. And you could use this to contrast the multicolored cards, the people caught in the middle that are still trying to pick a side, and therefore can be more flexible with what colors of mana they use for their Adamant costs. You could even give positive or negative effects to some of these cards if they're not cast for their Adamant cost, to show the benefits or consequences of refusing to pick a side entirely. Really depends on where you want to go flavor-wise. And yes, don't worry, we can probably also make a 5-color Adamant commander. This is just one of the infinite possibilities that could be utilized for Adamant, and again, maybe this hit the mark for you, maybe I'm just talking out my ass here. Either way, if you've got some ideas to put forward for Adamant, again, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to see them. Adamant is a mechanic that needed another pass before Throne of Eldraine released, and it didn't get that. Because of this, there's people that don't even know the mechanic exists. And that's a real shame, because despite some of the rigidness that Adamant has, there's still a lot of cool designs and ideas you can come up with that utilize the mechanic in both a powerful and flavorful way. It is yet another victim of jumping plane to plane every single set, and has been tossed in the trash alongside other mechanics that share the same fate. But Wizards of the Coast hasn't forgotten about it, and in Commander Masters in 2023 released a new Adamant card, Desecrate Reality. So maybe we're just a couple future sets away from Adamant making a return into the spotlight. But whether this optimistic prediction comes to pass, or if it continues to fade and fade into obscurity, I think we can all agree that Adamant, like all other one-off mechanics like it, deserved better.